He put his hand on the railing, and it was warm. Not warm the way iron gets in summer sun, warm the way a living thing is warm. And when he pulled his hand back, there were marks left in the metal. Not scratches, not rust, but the slow, soft impression of a palm closing around where his had been, like something beneath the iron had pressed back. He looked down into the gorge below, into that blue-black nothing, and he heard it then, a sound like a name, his name, spoken in a voice that had no business knowing it, and the fog came up to meet him. They say a man can walk these mountains his whole life and never find the same hollow twice. That is not poetry. That is a warning. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I've spent the better part of 40 years collecting accounts, railway records, surveyor notes, letters that never got sent, testimonies from folks who came down off the ridge line looking like something had reached inside them and rearranged the furniture. I keep these accounts in a cabinet beside my bed. I read them slow, the way old men read, because there's no hurry left in me. And some nights, when the wind off the Blue Ridge has a particular quality to it, a kind of hollow, searching sound, I read aloud, so that somebody else might hear, so that what happened in Cinder Gap doesn't just sit silent in a drawer somewhere, gathering the particular kind of dust that silence makes. This is Case File 081. The subject is a man named Elias Thorne, railway inspector, 3rd class, employed by the Piedmont Valley Line from 1947 through the autumn of 1959. His record was unremarkable by most standards. He was methodical. He was thorough. He was the kind of man who ate the same lunch every day: black coffee, a boiled egg, 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, and who kept his field notes in a precise, unhurried hand. His supervisor described him as a man who trusted what he could measure. That is the important part. Remember that. In October of 1959, Elias Thorne was dispatched to survey a stretch of disused railway corridor in the southwestern corner of what the company's maps labeled simply as Cinder Gap. The gap itself, a narrow, fog-prone hollow carved between 2 long-shouldered ridges, had once served a coal operation that closed in 1931. The railway spur had been officially decommissioned. The company wanted confirmation that no infrastructure remained that might create liability. A simple job, in other words. The kind they gave to reliable men because reliable men came back with clean numbers and no complications. And the company liked clean numbers above all else. It was, on paper, a 2-day job. The Gap had a reputation, the way certain hollows in those mountains always do. The locals, and there weren't many left by 1959, just a scattering of families tucked into the creek bends, referred to it in the particular roundabout way that mountain people refer to things they'd rather not name directly. They said the Gap was deep-natured. They said the fog there came from below, not above. They said you could hear the old mine breathing at night, even though the shafts had been sealed for decades. Elias had heard all of this second-hand at county diners and gas stations, and he had filed it in the same mental drawer where he kept all stories that couldn't be measured. Elias Thorne did not return for 11 days. When he did come back, he came back on foot, without his truck, without his field pack, without his lunch cloth or his boiled egg or his good measuring tape. He came back through a gap in the fence on Route 19 at approximately 3 in the morning, in the rain. A dairy farmer named Pudge Watkins found him sitting on a mile marker, his boots off, staring at nothing in particular. Pudge said the man's feet were not cut or blistered. He said they were clean, completely, perfectly clean, as though Elias had walked 11 days through Appalachian mud, and not a speck of it had touched him. Elias was brought to a county hospital. He was physically uninjured. He was, by medical assessment, in good health. He ate. He drank water. He slept. He did not speak for 4 days. When he did speak, it was to a nurse named Cora Dillard, who had sat with him through several long night shifts, simply because, he said, he had the look of a man who needed somebody nearby. She was not a trained interviewer. She was a woman of patience and mountain stock, and she wrote down what he told her on the back of a medication schedule form in pencil. And that form is what sits before me now. I will read it to you as close to his words as I am able. He said, "The first day was ordinary. The Gap road was overgrown, the way a road gets when the mountain starts taking it back, like the ground is slowly swallowing it from below. There was wet coal ash smell in the air, that particular smell, like burnt iron and old rain together, and the fog was low. Not unusual for that hollow. The old-timers in Cinder Gap had a name for the fog that settled there. They called it the breath of the in-between. He thought that was colorful nonsense when he'd heard it years ago at a feed store counter. He stopped thinking that on the second day. The sound started on the second night. He'd made camp in the cab of his truck, parked where the spur road widened near an old loading platform. He had his notes. He had his lamp. He was doing fine. And then, from somewhere down the hollow, from somewhere below the ridge where the tracks curved out of sight into fog and black timber, he heard it. Clink, clink, clink. Even, patient, rhythmic, like a hammer on cold iron, but soft. The kind of sound a man makes when he is working alone and unhurried and has all the time in the world. He listened for 20 minutes by his watch before he convinced himself it was water dripping onto a piece of old rail. He convinced himself of that because he needed to sleep, and a man who trusts what he can measure tends to reach for the nearest measurable explanation and hold on to it until morning. Morning came. The sound did not stop. He followed it on the third day, because Elias Thorne was above all else a thorough man. The sound led him down the spur line and around the curve he hadn't yet walked, and through a stand of hemlocks so dense that the fog caught in the branches like wool on a nail, and the light came through green and strange, and the wet coal ash smell deepened until it was almost a taste, almost a thing you could hold in your mouth. And then the trees opened, and he saw the bridge. Now, here is where I must ask you to understand something about Elias Thorne. He had inspected more than 200 bridges in his 12 years with the Piedmont Valley Line. He knew bridge construction the way a man knows his own hands, intuitively, practically, without needing to think. He knew steel truss from timber trestle from concrete span. He knew the language of load and tension and grade. He was not a man who was surprised by bridges. This bridge surprised him. It crossed a gorge he had no record of. The gorge itself was perhaps 80 feet across and very deep. How deep, he could not say, because the fog filled it entirely. And below the fog there was only a blue-black darkness that did not resolve no matter how long he stared. The bridge was narrow, single track, and it was, and here his voice as Cora recorded it dropped very low, it was wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way, not collapsed or rusted through. It was wrong the way a thing is wrong when your body understands before your mind does. When your hands go cold and your breathing goes shallow and some old animal part of you starts looking for the way back. He stood at the approach for a long time. The fog moved around his ankles like something curious. The cold had a weight to it, Not the ordinary cold of October mountain air, but a deeper, older cold. The kind that comes up from stone that hasn't seen sun in a very long while. He noticed that there were no birds. There had been birds all morning. Jays, a woodpecker somewhere in the hemlock dark. And now there was nothing. Only the fog. Only the cold. Only the sound. Then, because he was Elias Thorne, he took out his field notebook and he began to write down what he saw. The structure was a suspension design, he wrote. Though the cables did not look like cable, they looked, and he crossed out several words before landing on this. They looked grown, woven, like the metallic structures had been built the way a spider builds, strand by strand, from something that was not entirely manufactured. The color was wrong, too. True structural iron has a particular gray. This was darker, greenish almost, organic. And where the cables met the main span, there were... He stopped writing for a moment, he said, because he needed to look again and make sure he was seeing correctly. There were teeth, used as rivets, worn smooth. Human teeth, he was quite certain, set into the join points of the superstructure with a precision that was almost admirable. Almost. The beams of the span were pale, long, curved slightly in ways that structural beams do not curve. He did not write down what he thought those beams were made of. He wrote only, pale material, bone adjacent, do not touch. And then at the center of the bridge, he saw the figure. It was sitting, hunched over the railing on the downstream side, facing the gorge, facing the fog. It was the size and rough shape of a person, thin, very thin, dressed in something dark that moved more than the wind would account for. And it was working. Its hands were moving in that even, patient rhythm. Clink, clink, clink. A small hammer, or something like a hammer, against the railing, weaving something, adding to the structure in some way he could not fully see from where he stood. He called out. The sound stopped. The figure did not turn around. He called out again. His voice sounded strange to him in that hollow, flat, swallowed, like the fog was taking the sound apart before it could travel. He said it was the first time in his life his own voice had frightened him. The figure slowly raised one hand, not in greeting. It pointed down into the gorge, into the fog, into whatever was below the fog. And then it went back to its work. Clink, clink, clink. He doesn't remember the next 7 days. That is what he told Cora Dillard, in the careful accountant's voice of a man who has accepted something he cannot balance. He remembers the bridge. He remembers the sound. He remembers putting his hand on the railing. And here is where we return to where the story began, to the warmth, to the impression in the iron, to the feeling of something pressing back from beneath the metal. And then there is simply nothing. A gap. A hollow, if you'll forgive the word. 7 days that left no mark on his body, no mud on his feet, no hunger in his belly, no memory in his mind. Only a sound, faint and persistent, that he said he could still hear if the room was very quiet. Clink, clink, clink. Cora Dillard filed her notes with the hospital's records department. They were misfiled and sat for years before a records clerk, by accident or by something less explicable, placed them in a category labeled anomalous accounts, which is where I eventually found them, along with 47 other Cinder Gap documents that had no business being in the same drawer, but somehow were. A follow-up survey of the Cinder Gap spur line was conducted in January of 1960. The surveyors found the old loading platform, found the overgrown road, found the curve through the hemlocks. They found no gorge, no bridge. They did find, at the place where the hemlock stand opened up, a section of rail that had been worked on recently. The tie spikes had been removed and replaced with something the lead surveyor described as an unusual fastening, like a tooth. He collected one as a sample. The sample was lost before it reached the company office. The surveyor retired the following spring and moved to Florida, and did not, as far as anyone can determine, speak of Cinder Gap again. Elias Thorne was discharged from the hospital in November of 1959. He resigned from the Piedmont Valley Line shortly after. He moved to a small house in the valley, away from the mountains, away from the fog. His neighbor, a retired school teacher, told me that in the evenings Elias would sit on his porch and stare north toward the ridgeline, in the particular way that a man stares at something he is afraid of but cannot stop looking for. She said he did this for years. She said that one autumn morning she went to bring him a plate of food, the way neighbors do, and found his porch chair empty and his front door standing open and his boots sitting neatly on the mat. She said the boots were clean, completely, perfectly clean. And far off, from the direction of the ridge, so faint she almost convinced herself it was nothing. She said she heard a sound, even, patient, rhythmic, like a hammer on cold iron, like a man who is working alone and unhurried, like a man who has all the time in the world.